It is one of the most storied tales in the history of Canada. The hunt for the Mad Trapper was an event that cemented the history of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Canada and the world, and led to the phrase that a Mountie always gets his man. Much has been written about this manhunt that occurred in 1932, which ended on February 17th of that year after a 240-kilometer foot chase and shootout. From the use of the World War I flying ace Wap May to find the man, to the shootout, to the media circus around it. It took an airplane, the RCMP, Army, and First Nations to capture this man after weeks on the run. This video is not about that hunt, but about the Mad Trapper himself. Who was he, and what led to his date with the legendary RCMP? Going by the name Albert Johnson, which was a fake name, it is not easy to know who this man was before his date with history. It is known that Johnson arrived in Fort McPherson after coming down the Peel River on July 9, 1931. It is believed he was from Scandinavia, and he was described as a clean-shaven individual who appeared to have plenty of money. When he arrived at the fort, he was questioned by Edgar Millen, a constable with the RCMP, but little information was provided. Johnson then took his raft to the Mackenzie Delta, where he built a small cabin on the banks of the Rat River. At this time, Johnson had not purchased a trapping license, which was considered to be strange for anyone who lived in the bush. It was also around this time that the First Nations people were complaining of others coming into their land to hunt. A major reason for this was the Great Depression and the need for food for many with little money. In December of 1931, reports came in from trappers at Aklavik about tampering of traps. Traps were being tripped or hung from trees. It did not take long for the RCMP to begin to believe that Johnson was the likely individual. On December 26th, Constables Alfred King and Joe Bernard trekked 97 kilometers to Johnson's cabin. Upon arriving, they saw smoke coming out of the chimney, but Johnson refused to talk or even notice the officers. When King looked in the window, Johnson put a sack over it. It was decided to head back to Aklavik and get a search warrant. Upon their return 5 days later, King was shot through the door by Johnson after a firefight, and the team returned to Aklavik with the wounded King. The manhunt would soon begin. But that is another story, one that will be covered in a future video. But this video is about the Mad Trapper, so let's step back in time. As was mentioned, the Mad Trapper was described as Scandinavian. He was believed to be in his 30s, and scientists analyzing the isotopes in Johnson's teeth discovered that he grew up in northern United States or northern Scandinavia. In 2008, when scientists asked for DNA samples from Canadians, thousands submitted samples to see if they were related to the Mad Trapper himself. It is believed he lived in Iowa, India, or Ohio for a time, and he had sophisticated dental work done at some point. The RCMP also found $2,400 in his cabin, which would be $36,000 today. Many possible identities have been proposed for the Mad Trapper. One identity is that of Arthur Nelson, a prospector who was in British Columbia from 1927 to 1931 and left to live in the Arctic. Photos that exist of Nelson seem to lend evidence to this, as he shares several physical characteristics. The items recovered from Johnson after his death were identical to those owned by Nelson. Another rumored identity is that of American outlaw Johnny Johnson. Dick North, an author in the 1980s, put forward the theory that Arthur Johnson was actually the outlaw who was born in Norway in 1888 and moved to North Dakota, where he was a bank robber and horse thief. A third possibility is Owen Albert Johnson from Nova Scotia, who was last heard from in British Columbia in the 1920s. Several things like his appearance and disposition seem to fit, but this doesn't match the evidence found by scientists decades later. SIGVALD Peterson HASSKJOLD was also considered to be Albert Johnson, as he was last seen in northern British Columbia in 1927, and he was a man who preferred to be alone and was paranoid of anyone in authority. This was due to the fact that he evaded conscription during the First World War. He had a cabin near Prince Rupert where he built it like a fortress before he disappeared, and his appearance matched that of the Mad Trapper. The interesting part of all this is that all the descendants of those individuals were contacted when Albert Johnson's body was exhumed. Their DNA was run against that of Johnson, and the results found that not a single one shared DNA with the Mad Trapper himself. Delving further into Canadian history books, I found the history of Berwyn, which detailed that the Mad Trapper was in fact Edgar Maring. Edgar was described as a tough individual who was a crack shot and often talked of going to the Arctic. One day he decided to head north for good, and despite his boat overturning, he continued his journey. Ole Vashrud described receiving 2 letters from him describing the land as rough and the rivers as treacherous. In 1932, with news of the Mad Trapper, a picture appeared in the paper, and the people of Berwyn, along with Ole, said that the picture looked just like Edgar. Whether he was the Mad Trapper or not, no one knows. So who was the Mad Trapper? Chances are we'll never know for sure, and that'll just allow his legend to grow even more.